President Trump is planning to drop the Justice Department's controversial nearly $1.8 billion so-called anti-weaponization fund aimed at compensating alleged victims of lawfare under the Biden administration. Now, this fund, as we have been reporting, faced backlash over the potential of convicted January 6 rioters receiving payments, and it got pushback from both sides of the aisle. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us. So, Ed, what happened?
Well, Lindsay, there has been a statement from the Justice Department just in the last few minutes saying that they, in essence, disagree with a court ruling that had said that the Justice Department couldn't proceed with what it calls the anti-weaponization fund, as they put it, recently established in order to make up for the tremendous abuse, harm, and hate unfairly shown to so many people. They say it was open to anybody who was so weaponized, targeted, or persecuted, whether they were Democrat, Republican, conservative, independent, or otherwise. So the department will comply with this ruling. This Justice Department doesn't often immediately comply with a district court ruling on policy that they know is important or a priority to the president. But what's transpired here since the announcement of this fund is incredible Republican concern and anger directed at the Justice Department and the White House for establishing this anti-weaponization fund, what critics have called a slush fund, and the inability of the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche in a pretty contentious meeting nearly 2 weeks ago to explain to Republican senators what exactly this was about, who would be eligible, how the money would be doled out, who would be determining that, what kind of criteria would be used, and why on earth would they announce this at a time when the president's popularity is sinking, when approval of his handling of the economy and the war is driving down that approval, and there are growing fears among Republicans that between this new fund, between the construction going on behind us in the ballroom, and other projects that the president's focused on at a time when voters are saying you've got to be focused on the economy instead, how could you possibly do this? There was a meeting earlier today between the president and the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson doesn't often come over here by himself for that kind of a meeting. We've had no official readout of what it was, but there were reports suggesting that this was about his attempts to try to convince the president not to continue with this fund, understanding that the politics were tough and that perhaps Congress could find a way to work this into law in some other fashion, and not as part of the settlement that the president had announced in the last 2 weeks between him and the Internal Revenue Service regarding all those years of investigations into him and the leaking of his tax returns.
So what is your understanding of where the line is for his party and where they draw that line? Because as you mentioned, a lot of unpopular policies have still gone on. We still have the UFC fight, which organizers say won't cost taxpayers anything, but the ballroom, which also the president himself says is being paid for by private donors. But a lot of the remaking of Washington, you know, from all the way we could make the extension to the war, which is to a certain degree unpopular, our polling suggests. What is it about this fund that drew a solo visit from Johnson, you think?
Well, it was not just the meeting with the speaker, but it was that contentious meeting the acting attorney general had 2 weeks ago. There had been no heads up given to Congress. There was a concern that this was unconstitutional because it is Congress, after all, that authorizes spending, and that it couldn't come out of just a settlement between the American tax agency and the American president and involve the American Justice Department. And there were just too many unanswered questions from the acting attorney general to senators about the makeup of this, how it would be managed, and why it was even necessary to begin with, that the pushback and the continued outreach by those lawmakers into the White House was so intense that it seems the White House now understands it has to do this. But the speaker coming today, if it was indeed primarily or in part because of this, is a signal of how sensitive this was, not just to the most vulnerable of Republicans on the ballot this fall, but potentially to the entire caucus. The White House is asking Congress right now to authorize billions of dollars on a handful of things. One, tens of billions of dollars more for immigration and customs enforcement and the Customs and Border Protection agencies. The end result of the long shutdown that occurred, they're using legislation in a way where only Republicans need to pass it, and trying to, in essence, authorize tens of billions of dollars in funding for those agencies now before they potentially lose full control of Congress, at a time when there's been broad concern about immigration policy and what happened in Minneapolis earlier this year. So that's the underlying thing Republicans are being asked to do, and in some parts of the country still quite controversial and unpopular. Put on top of that, that huge request for funding that the White House says is mostly about security for the reconstruction of the East Wing, but was also seen, in essence, as congressional authorization of a construction project the president started on his own and never sought congressional approval for. And then you layer the slush fund or the weaponization fund on top of that, and that's when it hit a pressure point. And Republicans lashed out at the acting attorney general and said, if you can't provide us with a reason for this and a justification for it and a sense of how exactly money would be doled out and to who exactly, and they wouldn't even commit, as many Republicans wanted them to making sure that those that had assaulted and been charged and sentenced to time for assaulting federal law enforcement, that they said, then we can't support this. So the whole project, rooted in the immigration funding, had the potential to collapse. And the president still wants to see that happen as soon as possible, knowing that things could get tricky for them come November.
So you have already started a lot of on-the-ground reporting for the midterms, for the campaign, for potentially what will be the 2028 fight. Is it your sense that this pressure point is a one-off, or do you get a sense that there might be sort of a shift in the power play and dynamics between the president and Congress?
I think what they're seeing is continued polling at the national level and in key states and in key congressional districts that the president and his low approval for the economy and for the oversight of the war and growing concern about all these different projects is bleeding now into the election prospects of Republicans in the House and the Senate, and that the potential to lose the House exists and now the potential to lose the Senate exists. And that if you can convince the president now, at the beginning of the summer, to back off some of this stuff, maybe it staunches the bleeding and there won't be as much political pain paid by fellow Republicans in the fall. But you've heard the president now a handful of times in the last 10 days or so suggest, I don't care about the midterms, right? In the context of Iran, in the context of the potential effects of it on the economy, and just the general political pain that may come from his decisions. You've heard him say it, and there is a widespread public and private belief that he means it, that he is more concerned about getting his priorities done than whether or not Republicans will ultimately prevail in elections this fall. But congressional Republicans have to worry about getting reelected, and what he's been up to is proving with voters to be unpopular enough that it could cost even bigger losses for the GOP.
But Ed, is it possible that he's saying that to project strength in negotiations, knowing that the current Iranian regime wants him to suffer politically?
Yes, absolutely. But he's shown little in his actions otherwise, especially by announcing this settlement, for example. Why did he have to do it now? Or why didn't he ask Congress to do it instead? Why did he unilaterally do so? And why could he not provide, or could the Justice Department not provide any information to them when they asked about how exactly this would work? That's when it hit that pressure point that now shows them backing off. Again, this Justice Department statement, and if this is how the administration is going to announce this, it shows you how they're trying to minimize this and make it go away quickly. But the idea that the Justice Department says, oh, well, we have to abide by the court's ruling. This is a Justice Department that has fought just about every court ruling that is of importance to the president and his priorities and his personal projects. So for them to back off like this and say, oh, there's nothing we can do, is a sign that they've heard the political message from fellow Republicans up on Capitol Hill to back off and make this go away for now.
Okay, Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much. Let's now go to CBS News Department of Justice reporter Jake Rosen. So we were talking about the DOJ statement. Jake, what would you like to add?
Well, I just want to correct what this statement really is all about, Lindsay. There was an order last week from a judge in the Eastern District of Virginia, just south of here in Washington, D.C., basically pausing the fund and any movement on it, whether it's transferring money into or out of it, for the next 2 weeks as she considered the merits of the case. It was brought by a professor that was arrested earlier in this administration who says that he should have access to that money if the fund did not go away, and also a former federal prosecutor who worked on January 6 prosecutions. There were a number of other legal challenges to this as well. Here in the district, 2 police officers who clashed with those rioters on January 6, 2021, were also suing to potentially block it. And in days of conversations with legal experts and people at the Department of Justice, former and current, who have worked on these kinds of projects in the past, which were approved by Congress, they all said that the only way to really stop this, just because of a congressional mandate, which gives the Department of Justice essentially an unlimited blank check every year to settle lawsuits so that Congress doesn't need to appropriate money one by one, that the only way to stop this was for the administration to do it themselves. As Ed just pointed out, the rationale why, because of this congressional budget package, but we should just correct that this judge's ruling was only temporary. It seems to kind of a week or so late to kind of cast blame on this judge. And also, the Department of Justice in that same statement says that anyone could have applied for that fund, Republican, Democrat, or independent. Well, we just don't know whether that's true or not, because, Lindsay, there was no very strict criteria enacted in the writing of this settlement by the acting Attorney General, I should say, Todd Blanche, to lay out what the clear criteria was of who actually has access to this and how payments would play out. There would be 5 members who would be picked by the Attorney General. One of them would be in consultation with Congress, and then Deputy Attorney General, who is now acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, said it would be up to those 5 people to then determine what weaponization means, who would potentially get a payout, and whether, as Ed pointed out, the real blowback in Congress, whether any of those 1,500 people who had their sentences pardoned or convictions pardoned for their actions on January 6th would be entitled to anything, especially those convicted of the most violent acts that day or seditious conspiracy.
And Jake, I believe it was Friday. All the days are sort of blurring together. But when one of the judges had actually said that she wanted to reopen the lawsuit to make sure that the government wasn't a victim of fraud. Can you detail that a little bit more for us?
Absolutely. It was late Friday, although it feels like a couple of weeks ago, Lindsay, that the judge who oversaw this settlement in the lawsuit in Florida, she is a democratically appointed federal judge who oversaw this lawsuit in the very brief days that it actually kind of had any movement on it. What happened in this lawsuit was that President Trump brought this case because he believed that his tax returns were unlawfully released, which is true. There was a government contractor who was convicted for his actions in illegally leaking the Trump Organization's tax returns, President Trump's tax returns, in addition to the tax returns of his sons. What was rewarded by suing his own Department of Justice in his personal capacity and his own IRS was this massive creation of this fund and also immunity for his organization and his sons to be investigated by the IRS for any tax return that's already been filed. Part of this, the judge said at the initial time of the settlement, Lindsay, that she actually had no power to kind of nitpick through it. However, 35 former federal judges who oversaw things like appeals courts and U.S. district courts all around the country came together and asked the judge to open up this case, of which she agreed. She gave the Department of Justice 2 weeks from last Friday to go and answer questions about whether or not there was some kind of collusive effort, to use this judge's words, between President Trump, his White House, and his Department of Justice and Treasury to make this fund a creation and to settle this suit while granting the president immunity from any potential personal obligations on the IRS front and his organization. In addition to that, essentially suing yourself when you're two sides of the same coin, this judge said. She didn't even know whether she actually had standing to oversee this case because the lawsuit may not be valid if you have control of the left arm and the right. This judge said President Trump needed maybe even to not bring this lawsuit in the first place and simply could have settled this outside of court.
Yeah, there's no drama here. There's no case here. So do we know how many people filed to be compensated? Because I know at the time, not only were some people who were convicted and then pardoned in the January 6th riot saying they were absolutely going to apply, but people like Trump's former lawyer and former fixer turned critic Michael Cohen said so. I believe former CNN journalist Jim Acosta said so. So do we know how many people filed?
We don't have a firm number, and this is part of the lack of transparency that the creation of this fund brought and the criticism that came right after it. I spoke to Michael Cohen. He said he was going to apply. We saw lawyers representing dozens, if not hundreds, of former January 6 defendants who were saying that they're going to bring these kinds of cases. And the reason we don't know, Lindsay, is because this 5-member commission was not officially named, and the Department of Treasury had 60 days to officially set up this fund. As we know, it's been well within that. That doesn't mean that there weren't actions taken in the Department of Justice to start looking through these, because, Lindsay, there just isn't a real oversight mechanism. The only person, according to the very few pages of actual documentation we have on this, Lindsay, to break down who's accountable for what and who can audit what, is the Attorney General. He would have to order an audit of this fund to get a clear breakdown of who's getting what. And it just wouldn't be clear whether a January 6 rioter who assaulted one police officer on one part of the Capitol and one part on the other would even receive the same payment, because the details of this were just so gray and vague, which is part of the frustration you saw on Capitol Hill, and that's how we got to today.
Jake Rosen, thank you so much.